In United States history, the Catholic Church has long been at the center of conspiracy theories. Today, theorists claim that major national decisions are orchestrated by the Church through government plants, powerful overseas interests, and secret agents. There are variants of the theory, but generally, theorists seem to agree the Church is trying to weaken and divide the United States and set up presidents who will bow to their power. Multiple presidents' deaths have been blamed on the Church. These aren't all presidents of one particular party, as that doesn't define whether someone will be a target. Supposed victims include William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, who were part of the Whig Party, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, and John F. Kennedy, a Democrat. What makes someone a target is whether or not they defy the will of the Church. The theory starts with the 1835 assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson. After failing to kill the president, Jackson's would-be assassin, Richard Lawrence, was taken into custody. He wasn't concerned about his imprisonment, however. He told his family he had powerful connections back in Europe who would lighten his sentence. This claim isn't taken seriously. During police interrogations, Lawrence was found to be completely delusional, believing himself to be King Richard III. His delusions motivated the assassination attempt and also explain why he thought he had powerful connections in Europe. Theorists disagree. They claim Lawrence only pretended to be insane and was secretly an agent of the Catholic Church. Supposedly, the Church had many disagreements with Jackson. One of these was over nullification. Nullification is a legal theory which claims that states have the right to disregard federal law which they don't want to follow. Jackson hated nullification and saw it as a threat to the Union. He generally supported states' rights, but nullification was a step too far. In contrast, the Church, according to theorists, supported nullification for the exact opposite reason Jackson opposed it, because it weakened the Union. On the forefront of the battle over nullification was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun argued that if issues with the federal government couldn't be resolved, that a state had the right to secede as a last resort. Supposedly, Calhoun was secretly loyal to the Catholic Church and had used Lawrence to try to assassinate Jackson. In 1841, William Henry Harrison died just a month after taking office. Apparently, in his brief time as president, he'd already incurred the wrath of the Church with his inaugural address, which stated, "We admit of no government by divine right, believing that so far as power is concerned, the beneficent Creator has made no distinction among men, that all are upon an equality, and that the only legitimate right to govern is upon the expressed grant of power from the governed." As one theorist put it, quote, Harrison's statement was a dagger aimed at the heart of the papacy's existence, and thus he was poisoned. 9 years later, Zachary Taylor died. Officially, Taylor died from a stomach ailment. Theorists claim that he was poisoned by Southern officials who at this point were in league with the Catholic Church. Like with Jackson, one motive was simply that Taylor was a strong Unionist, but another was that he wouldn't invade Cuba. Theorists claim a Cuban invasion would have left the United States weakened and in a prime position for invasion by European Catholic powers. Taylor's opposition to the expansion of slavery also put a target on his back, as theorists claim the Church strongly endorsed the practice. 7 years later, President-elect James Buchanan became sick after dining with Southern leaders. Buchanan, while sympathetic towards the South and a Democrat, was nonetheless a Northerner. Theorists say the Jesuits attempted to poison Buchanan before he ever took office, so that his more radical Southern vice president could assume the presidency. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president. As a staunch Unionist and passionate anti-slavery advocate, his goals were opposed in almost every way to the Church. However, his election had prompted Southern states to rebel and try to secede from the Union, something theorists claim the Church long desired. They also claim the Confederate President Jefferson Davis was a secret Catholic convert and that he conspired with Pope Pius IX throughout the war. Unexpectedly, however, Lincoln actually succeeded in putting down the rebellion and keeping the Union together. In a last-ditch effort to reinvigorate the Confederacy, the church used their secret agent and loyal convert John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Lincoln. Similarly, William McKinley was assassinated in 1909 by Leon Czolgosz. More than 30 years after Lincoln's death and the Civil War, the fight to split the United States and create a pro-slavery Confederacy was long lost. However, theorists claim McKinley was planning to issue a statement about corruption in the Catholic Church. Thus, like with Lincoln, the church used a young and passionate agent to assassinate the president. Theorists claim the church's reach went far beyond presidential assassinations, and that they instigated numerous national and world tragedies and wars in the service of increasing their power. These were events as distant as the sinking of the Titanic and as recent as the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center towers. And supposedly, their most recent presidential assassination was John F. Kennedy in 1963. Though a Catholic himself, Kennedy had supposedly held greater loyalty to his country than to his church, which got him killed. It's hard to say when these conspiracy theories started, but the theories persist to this day. Theories about the church, whether its involvement in United States politics, international politics, or just theories about general corruption, are so prevalent and originate from so many different places that it's hard to pin down any source. Sometimes a theory would be propped up by a political, social, or religious movement, die out, and then reemerge through new theorists, new books, or simply through people referring to older sources. Theories about the church pulling the strings behind major world events have gone back centuries before the United States even existed. So unlike other theories, there is no definitive end or beginning to point to. When it comes to presidential assassinations, it generally seems that theories originate long after the assassinations and are simply plugged into whatever larger theory the author is proposing. For example, theorists say the church wanted Andrew Jackson dead because he was opposed to the National Bank, or they'll say that the church supported the Confederacy and thus they wanted Lincoln dead, or they wanted war in Vietnam and didn't want Kennedy de-escalating the conflict. The book titled The Secret Terrorist by Bill Hughes was the source for much of this video. It was published in 2005, but there's no telling how long some of the theories within the book had been going around before the publication. Charles Chiniquy was the man who proposed the most popular theory of the church's involvement in the Lincoln assassination. He published his book in 1886. This was 2 decades after Lincoln's death. By contrast, other theories, claiming Jefferson Davis was involved in Lincoln's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy's, or rival Republicans and James A. Garfield's, all spawned immediately after their respective assassinations. Generally speaking, the Catholic theories pop up long after. However, there were exceptions. After Zachary Taylor's death, Millard Fillmore did receive a letter claiming Taylor had been poisoned by Jesuit officials. Shortly after McKinley's death, the newspaper, the American Baptist Flag, suspected that the Jesuits were behind the assassination. A few days later, when it was announced that Leon Czolgosz was Catholic, they took it as evidence. These seemed to be nothing more than finger-pointing from anti-Catholics at the time. The United States has a long history of anti-Catholic sentiment, stretching all the way back to its colonial days, when Puritans and Congregationalists moved to the New World to freely practice their religion and escape the church. By the 1840s and 1850s, this sentiment intensified as German and Irish Catholics immigrated to the United States. Tensions arose as Americans feared immigrants taking their jobs, not to mention the natural conflicts that arose from the religious differences. Often these conflicts turned violent. Conspiracy theorists began claiming that bishops in the United States, under the direct orders of Pope Pius IX, were conspiring to take control of the country with the mass influx of immigrants. The immigrants were generally poor and desperate people looking for opportunity, but theorists alleged they were being used by Catholic officials to increase church power in the United States. These theories were so prevalent that they often made newspaper headlines. The Know Nothing Party was the first major party to capitalize on this conflict and make it political. Known as a nativist party, their platform was anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. They occupied a major place on the political stage in the 1850s, in a period between the fall of the Whig Party and the rise of the Republican Party. Theories about the Catholic Church's involvement in presidential assassinations and general meddling in the United States are still going today. Discussing or refuting all of these in depth is simply beyond the scope of this video series and this channel. This channel doesn't specialize in Catholic Church history, but some theories are easy enough to refute. For example, theorists claim the Church supported the Confederacy to dissolve the United States, expand slavery, and spread their influence throughout the new Confederate government by converting its leaders to Catholicism, making them loyal disciples of the Pope. This is based on some truth, though heavily extrapolated and distorted. In the mid-1800s, Catholics largely voted for the Democratic Party, the party associated with endorsing slavery or at least not interfering with it on a federal level. But to simply say that Catholics or anyone affiliated with the Democratic Party of the mid-1800s was pro-slavery, and thus by extension supportive of the Confederate Rebellion, is an oversimplification which ignores nuance. Regardless of positions on slavery, many Catholics gravitated towards the Democrats because of anti-Catholic sentiment in other parties. Once the Confederacy was established, there were no doubt many Catholics living in the southern states. However, there were also many in the northern states, though both groups would rally under separate church leaders. The Pope's relationship with the Confederacy has also been greatly exaggerated. The Confederate government did reach out to the Church for support. Pope Pius was sympathetic and urged for the two sides to make peace, but never made any political moves to help the South. A large reason for people today believing that Pius supported the Confederacy was because of Confederate propaganda from a century and a half ago. Pius wrote a letter in which he addressed Jefferson Davis as the Honorable President of the Confederate States of America. The Confederates used this as evidence that they'd been formally recognized by the Church. Even in the previous video in this series, this fact was incorrectly stated, as pointed out by a viewer. There is no evidence that John Wilkes Booth was a Catholic. In fact, he'd been a member of the Know Nothing Party, though theorists allege he converted sometime during the Civil War. Leon Czolgosz did come from a Catholic family, but he didn't hold to his family's beliefs. Some theorists claim that John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis were secretly Catholic, but there's no evidence of this either. Theorists also claim that Calhoun had hired Richard Lawrence to try to assassinate Jackson. This is likely conflated with another conspiracy theory. After the attempt on his life, Andrew Jackson spread the rumor that Calhoun and other politicians were behind the attempt. This is discussed in greater detail in part 1 of the series. But for one, this theory was quickly debunked after it was discovered that Lawrence was delusional, and two, if it were true, it doesn't prove the Catholic Church was involved in any way, only that Jackson's political opponents were. The Church's views on slavery are also grossly oversimplified by theorists. Pope Pius IX had affirmed in 1866 that slavery, under certain conditions, wasn't against divine law. However, one of his reasons for not recognizing the Confederacy was because of its stance on slavery. As mentioned, this video won't be going into every detail and claim of conspiracy theorists, but this should at least give some examples of how many of the theories extrapolate on facts and bend the truth, or in some cases, how theorists may simply be misled by false claims from long ago. The next video in this series will be returning to individual presidents. and the only assassinated president who is absent from the Catholic Church conspiracy theory, James A. Garfield. In fact, Garfield is absent from most larger theories, as the politics around his death are mostly forgotten and far removed from the issues of today. While theorists today have little interest in the topic, this was hardly the case at the time, as the theory that Garfield had been killed by rival elements in his own party was extremely pervasive. Stay tuned for that and future videos on United States presidents. To support the channel, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Patreon link in the description below.